afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on the value of trees in a hotter climate. This session is co-hosted by the Woodland Trust, who I work for, and for MVArc, an agroforestry research centre based out in Portugal. So we might be in the midst of the Northern Hemisphere winter, and in fact, Spain in particular seems to be experiencing extremely cold conditions at the moment. But I think that's just a reflection of the increased frequency of extreme weather patterns that we're all starting to face. Here in the UK, the 2018 bitterly cold conditions, known locally as the beast from the east, was followed by a summer of record-breaking heat and drought. So it's becoming increasingly important that we create more resilient farming systems. And this is where trees come in. Trees within farming systems, often referred to as agroforestry, can buffer extreme weather by providing shade and shelter for both crops and livestock and help make farms more resilient. So here in Britain, we're really keen to learn from areas of the world already farming in hotter climates. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you today speakers from the USA and Spain, as well as the UK, who will share their experiences both in terms of research and practical experience of integrating trees into farms. But very quickly before we start, I'd just like to highlight a few quick housekeeping points. Each speaker will give a presentation lasting about 10 minutes, and then we'll have questions at the end. So do please put these questions into the Ask a Question tab as we go along, and do vote for which one you would like most to be answered. Please use the chat to introduce yourself and your organisation, comment on the discussion as we go along, and add any links to relevant information that you think others will be interested in. We also have a breakout area on Zoom directly after this session, where you'll have a chance to ask further questions to our panellists, so I do hope you can join us. A link to this Zoom meeting will be posted in the chat towards the end of this session. And very quickly, the Woodland Trust has an exhibition area with links to further information and guidance. And this includes the Agroforestry Handbook, which is a UK publication by the Soil Association that both Paul, one of our speakers, and Dr. Joe Smith from the MVArc Research Centre in Portugal both contributed to. In the exhibition area, there are also links to the advice and support the Woodland Trust can provide to farmers in the UK who want to plant agroforestry schemes. And finally, do look out for the various agroforestry networks that are across the world. The Farm Woodland Forum in the UK, EURAF in Europe, and AFTA in North America are some of those. And Dr. Joe Smith will be in Crowdcast and hopefully add the links to the chat for you. So less of me, now over to our first speaker, who is Paul Burgess, Associate Professor in Crop Ecology and Management from Cranfield University. Paul led the European Agroforestry Project AgForward, and today will provide an overview of recent and predicted temperatures in the UK and the effect of shade from trees on livestock. Over to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks very much, Helen, for the introduction. Thanks to the Woodland Trust and for MVArc for arranging this session. Can my slides be shown? Okay, I presume my slides are being shown. So I'd like to talk about climate change, the increasing role of tree shade in the UK. And in this talk, there are effectively four things that I want to go through. Firstly, to just briefly review the effect of shade on livestock, to describe how temperatures in the UK have changed and how they're predicted to change. And then to describe some experimental results describing how trees can modify temperatures and crop growth. So I think it's useful to start with this photo. So thanks to Zhao from MVArc who provided this photo of some sheep taking some well-earned rest in the shade. So I guess the shade provides a range of things. Firstly, it reduces the amount of solar radiation coming in, but it also sort of reduces the temperature. And it's primarily the sort of temperature effects that I'll be concentrating on in my talk. Heat stress and its effect on livestock has been sort of researched by a number of researchers around the globe. And here's some data provided by two researchers from Iowa University looking at the air temperatures at which cattle, hens, and pigs start suffering from heat stress. The level of heat stress suffered by cattle depends in part on the humidity. So these are all values for 80% humidity, a sort of typical value for the UK. And as you can see there, alert levels start being reached when pigs subjected to an air temperature of about 24 and about 25 for cattle and hens. So the advice in this sort of tool from the University of Iowa is once cattle start reaching alert levels, then they advise the sort of setting up of cooling sheds, or we would argue the need for having trees. What I want to do now is to look at some temperature data. This is all for southern England. So there's a range of things shown in this graph. So obviously temperatures in the UK vary with season, and what I've plotted up here are the minimum temperatures there in blue and the maximum temperatures in any particular month. And we can see during the year the change in temperature by about 10 degrees Celsius. And then we've got a change or a variation of about 8 degrees Celsius between the minimum and maximum at any particular time. The solid lines there show the mean temperatures from 61 to 90. But we can see that once we reach the sort of 1981 to 2020, that the temperatures have increased. So over that 20-year period, on average, maximum and minimum temperatures here in southern England have all increased by about 0.5 or 0.7 degrees Celsius. So across England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, these are some maps from the Meteorological Office showing the areas of the country where the mean maximum temperature in summer, that's June, July and August, reaches a certain level. So we can see here, certainly in southern England, that the proportion of the country where the mean maximum temperature in the summer is above 21 degrees Celsius has substantially increased over the 20-year period shown. This graph here shows some the mean temperature in a range of years from 1900 through to 2020 for the Ratcliffe Meteorological Station in Oxford, which is the sort of home of the conference here today. So you can see that from year to year there's substantial interannual variation. So as Helen was mentioning at the beginning, some years in particular, 2018, are substantially hotter than the average year. But we can also see that certainly since the 1960s through to the mid-1980s, there's been a trend for the mean temperature to increase. And depending on the base year that we choose and the year that we choose to compare it with, that has shown an increase of, let's say, 0.7 degrees Celsius if we look at 61 to 90 up to 81 to 2010, or as much as a degree if we look to the last sort of 10 years. So temperatures are definitely increasing. Here's some results from the UK Committee on Climate Change. So since the 1961-1990, the temperatures increased by about a degree Celsius, and the sort of mid-estimate predictions, certainly for the UK, is for that temperature to increase by another 2 degrees Celsius by 2085. It's not just the average temperature that's the key issue, it's the level of frequency of heat waves such as we experienced in 2018. So whereas heat waves such as in 2018 might occur in sort of 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 years at present, by the time we get to 2085, it's predicted that most years would have a sort of heat wave similar to 2018. And so far, we've just been talking about mean temperatures, the monthly mean maximum temperature, but over and above that, on a specific day, the absolute maximum may even be an extra 5 or 7 degrees Celsius higher. So here's some examples showing the differences between the mean temperature, the mean monthly maximum temperature, and the absolute maximum temperature for a range of months back into that heat wave in 2018. So what are the potential role of trees? So looking at some of the results that are available across Europe, this graph here, or these images, show some results from an agroforestry experiment. I was involved with some colleagues at Cottbus University in the east of Germany, who measured the sort of diurnal daily temperatures within a sort of tree canopy within an arable sort of wheat field. They found certainly during the day, typically the trees were able to reduce the air temperature by about 1 degree Celsius for about sort of 36–40% of the time, and on sort of extreme occasions were able to reduce the temperature by about 7 degrees Celsius. So that's during the daytime. During the night, the opposite occurs. So the canopy of the trees help moderate the temperature. So at night times, typically the temperature within the trees was about 1 degree Celsius higher for about 40% of the time, reaching 5 degrees Celsius plus on one occasion. So such results highlight the moderating effect of trees. Here's some results from Portugal. Again, looking here at daytime measurements of temperature outside of the tree canopy and under the tree canopy, clearly showing that in the daytime, the shade provided by the trees were able to reduce the sort of temperatures, typically by about 1.2, 1.7 degrees Celsius. What's the effect of reducing that temperature? One of the effects is to reduce the development rate of the crop, so the crop or the grass crop stays immature for longer, and the crude protein contents of the grass are higher. And if you look at the photograph on the right, you can see the greener patches of grass under the trees. 2 years ago, we did some work at Cranfield University looking at how different levels of tree cover will affect total grass yields. And this is for some work we completed in Spain. This analysis showed that we could maintain up to about 50% tree cover in Spain before yields of grass sort of significantly declined. Admittedly, the grass yields are very low. And in this particular example, where the farmer was producing Ibera sort of ham for sale, the added benefit of the trees in terms of acorn production was sufficient to maximize gross margins at a sort of intermediate tree cover than under zero tree cover. And lastly, just to highlight, it's not just sort of livestock and crops that benefit from the moderating effects of trees. These are some results showing the effect of different levels of tree cover on surface temperatures in Manchester. Again, showing that just the imposition or the creation of about 5% sort of new tree cover would typically reduce surface temperatures by about a degree Celsius below that of grass, and 5 degrees Celsius below that of sort of tarmac. So in conclusion, in terms of just providing an overview of the effects of trees in a hotter climate, so livestock may start suffering from heat stress at about 24 degrees Celsius. That's assuming a relative humidity of about 80%. The mean maximum temperature in southern England is typically about 22 degrees Celsius. but it is higher in specific years and on specific days. So the temperature on a specific day can easily be 10 degrees Celsius higher than the mean. Temperatures in the UK, as elsewhere, are increasing. In broad terms, about a degree higher now than they were in sort of the 60s, 70s, 80s. And it's anticipated that by 2085, there'll be a further increase of another 2 degrees Celsius. And tree canopies can play an important role in reducing the maximum air and surface temperatures, as shown by some of the experimental results I've shown, typically by about 1 degree Celsius, although on individual days, that reduction could be substantially higher. So thank you for listening to the presentation, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was an excellent overview to get the discussion going. So I'm delighted now to introduce our second speaker, Guadalupe Arenas-Corraliza from the University of Extremadura in Spain. She will give an overview of the research that she's undertaking on the acclimation of winter cereals in different agroforestry conditions. So over to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm María Guadalupe Arenas. First of all, I would like to thank the UK Woodland Trust and the MVArc for giving me the opportunity to share my thesis findings in this conference. I think that the presentation is on screen now. So I'm going to start. As we know, the global warming will decrease cereal production, especially for major crops like wheat and barley. Agroforestry systems have been recognized as a climate change adaptation tool because trees help to buffer extreme temperatures beneath them. However, most cereal species and cultivars have traditionally been selected for full light conditions, and this is why we need selection programs to identify shade-adapted cereals, species and cultivars for cultivation in agroforestry systems under the tree shade. The context of my research is Spain, where the mean of maximum temperatures is 6 degrees higher than in the UK, and the mean of minimum temperatures is 3 degrees higher than in the UK. And in addition, the global solar radiation in Spain is much higher than in the rest of Europe. So the climatological conditions in Spain are warmer and lighter than in the UK. The aim of this thesis, my thesis, was to assess the extent of shade adaptations of winter wheat and barley in Mediterranean conditions. Our questions were: is grain yield affected by low irradiance conditions in both barley and wheat species? Are barley and wheat able to acclimate to shaded environments in terms of physiology? And what are the interactions between trees and cereal crops in different Mediterranean agroforestry systems? Well, to answer these questions, we carried out 2 experiments in central Spain. 9 cultivars of barley and 9 cultivars of wheat were then tested in 2 scenarios. First, the setting A, which was a greenhouse experiment with 3 artificial shading levels, and then setting B, which was a field experiment in which barley and wheat cultivars, shade adapted from the greenhouse test, were then tested in 2 Mediterranean agroforestry systems, one plantation and dehesa. In the first place, the greenhouse experiment had 3 different artificial shading levels. As we can see here, S0, here in red, which represented full light conditions, S1, here in green, which represented 90% of irradiance, and S2, here in blue, which represented only 50% of irradiance. For both wheat and barley species, the grain yield increased in the shading levels, although they follow very different acclimation strategies to shade. On the one hand, barley had a greater photosynthetic acclimation to shade than wheat, as revealed by the change in the electron transport rate and the non-photochemical quenching parameters in the different shading levels. On the other hand, wheat cultivars were morphologically better adapted to shade than barley, as revealed by the lower leaf mass area, that is to say, the lower leaf thickness of these cultivars in the shading levels compared to the full light conditions. What is most important here is that the fact that some cultivars had greater plasticity than others to adapt to different shading conditions. It's important because it indicates that there could be enough variability in the current commercialized cereal cultivars to start selection programs to identify cereals adapted to shade. And in the second place, in the field experiment, was divided in two agroforestry systems. First, in the walnut plantation with cereals, we saw that there was a strong light reduction beneath the trees compared to the full light conditions, and that this light reduction was associated with a temperature reduction beneath the trees compared to the cereal monocrops at the cereal canopy level, around 3 degrees less under the trees than in the full light conditions. The agroforestry system of walnuts helped to increase barley and wheat grain yield the years with warm and dry springs, so trees acted like a shelter to the cereal. But on the contrary, the years with normal spring, that is, abundant rainfall, trees were detrimental for cereal grain yield. Nevertheless, the land equivalent ratio of this agroforestry system was all years higher than 1, proving the productivity and the sustainable land use of the agroforestry system compared to the walnut sole plantations and cereal monocrops separated. Concerning cereal plant biomass evolution, although at the early stage of cereal development, plant biomass of wheat and barley was higher in the agroforestry system, from the walnut budburs on, the trend was the opposite, and wheat and barley plant biomass was lower in the agroforestry system compared to the full light conditions. So trees had a negative impact on the cereal plant biomass evolution. On the other hand, trees advanced cereal growth for both barley and wheat until the last stage of cereal development, proven by the monitoring of the zadox growth stage. In addition, the agroforestry system has some important physiological benefits from cereals, such as less cell membrane damage in wheat and barley leaves grown beneath the trees compared to the cereal monocrops, as revealed by the lower electrolytic leakage in these wheat and barley leaves in the agroforestry system. And also, trees help to increase the relative water content of wheat and barley leaves compared to the cereal monocrops. In addition, trees help to increase NDVI and PRI indexes in wheat and barley species compared to the full light conditions, revealing a general better physiological status of the cereal grown in the agroforestry system. And in the field experiment set up in the Dehesa agroforestry system, the light reduction was greater than in the walnut plantation, and this light reduction was linked to an also greater temperature decrease beneath this kind of trees compared to the monocrops conditions, around 6 degrees less under the trees than in full light conditions at the cereal canopy level, especially at midday, when here in Spain temperatures reach almost 40 degrees at the beginning of the summer, that is during cereal maturation. Unsurprisingly, although the year of the study here in the Dehesa had a normal spring, that is abundant rainfall, trees helped to increase barley grain yield and were not detrimental for wheat grain yield, unlike the walnut plantation. And also, trees helped to significantly increase grain nitrogen content of both barley and wheat in the agroforestry system compared to the full light conditions, contrary in this situation to the walnut plantation effect. So the conclusions of the study are that both wheat and barley increase their grain yield under low irradiance conditions using different acclimation strategies. Barley showed greater photosynthetic acclimation to shade than wheat, while wheat underwent a major morphological adaptation to shade. The cereal response to agroforestry conditions depends, therefore, on the cereal species and cultivar, the system, and the year. But in general terms, the shade of trees help to regulate the climate beneath them, favoring cereal performance and land use. So thanks you all for your attention, and I'm glad to answer any questions that you can make.
Thank you very much, Guadalupe. That's really interesting, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions at the end. So I'd like to introduce our third speaker, who is Brett Chedzoy, an extension forester from Cornell University in New York State. He will share his practical experience of working in silvopasture over the last 30 years, both in New York State and in Argentina. So over to you, Brett.
Thank you, Helen. All right, so figure out how to pull up that, do that. Let's see, just want to try to get it into full screen mode if we can. Oh. Presentation.
Brett, are you having a hard time getting your screen to go full screen?
Yes.
Are you able to start the slideshow? There's a button on the bottom right corner of the screen. It looks like a little TV on a tripod stand. That's typically one way to do it. You know what? I'll share your slides and you can tell me when you want the next slide.
Okay, that'd be fine. Thank you, Josh. So as Josh is pulling that up, I'm a regional extension forester with Cornell University Cooperative Extension, and our family also owns and operates large grazing operations in upstate New York and in central Argentina in the Sierra Mountains. Next slide, please. So today I want to talk a little bit about the role of silvopasturing in reducing heat stress for our livestock operations in these two quite different climates. You can see images there of what it looks like at our ranch in central Argentina and our farm in upstate New York. That's my gang there in the lower photo. And one thing about our farm in New York is we abut the Watkins Glen State Park, which is New York's second largest and most visited park in New York after Niagara Falls. Next slide. So silvopasturing is, just so that we understand what we're talking about here, we're really trying to grow quality trees and quality forages together for quality grazing for our livestock. That's my very simple definition of silvopasturing. Next slide, please. And this is really very different than woodland grazing of the past, which had a negative connotation associated with it for the better part of 60 or 70 years here in the northeastern United States, where farm woodlots were often used as sacrifice paddocks, and consequently there was very little benefit both to the woods and the animals. Next slide. So I think of silvopasturing as simply we're cutting out the firewood quality trees from our woods in order to grow good quality forages. We want to reallocate that sunlight from plants that are well above the soil surface to the soil surface where we can then grow forages. And Paul had mentioned in his presentation that they were seeing good growth rates of herbaceous plants at about 50% canopy. And when you look at the typical plantation or natural existing woods, often that's what you see is about 50% of your trees are good quality trees that are going to be productive and are worth growing, and the other 50% roughly are not so much in terms of number of trees, but really in the space that they occupy, are trees that are really just, they're either suppressed trees or defective or have some quality issue. And so in the case of our silvopasture plantations and systems, what we're really doing is taking out those lower quality trees so that we can utilize that crucial ingredient of sunlight. Next slide, please. And one of the ways that we avoid the negative impacts associated with the historic woodland grazing is that silvopasturing really is intensive rotational grazing. The animals are always on the move, and this is an aerial slide here of part of our home farm. We have a 500-acre contiguous grazing operation, and about half of that is in silvopasture systems. But if you look carefully there, you can see that the 200-acre home farm is intensively divided up into 50 paddocks that range roughly about an 1.5 hectares to 2 hectares each. So the animals are moving daily to a new paddock, and that's how we avoid some of these issues like damage to trees, soil compaction, and restless animals doing things we don't want them to do. Next slide. And silvopasturing, another key part of silvopasture systems is that we're periodically, perhaps once during the grazing season, sometimes more frequently, sometimes less frequently, but we're grazing at a very high density, and that's because we don't have the tools available to us like going in and mowing pastures or spraying pastures or even plowing up and reseeding pastures. So we really have to rely on this beneficial form of livestock impact to trample down the vegetation and reset it. Next slide. And that opportunity to use animal impact in a positive way continues year-round on both of our ranches. This is an image here from our farm in New York, where we do rotational bale grazing during the winter months, and we seek, anytime the ground conditions are suitable, we try to do as much of that as possible in our silvopasture areas and put these round bales in patches of soft invasive brush, and that creates a density, a sustained density of about 1.5 million pounds per acre. I believe it's but anyhow, the animals will really trample down and smash and set back the plants that we don't want to overtake the site. Next slide, please. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're having adequate rest and recovery periods between the grazings, and that's partly because these plants are growing in slightly lower sunlight levels, so it may take them a little longer to reach maturity and set seed and recover after grazings. Next slide. Just some of the reasons that we do silvopasturing on our farm is the obvious one that we're talking about here today, that our grazing animals are more comfortable. And here, both here and in our ranch in Argentina, any day that it reaches much above 20 degrees Celsius, you can see the animals actively seeking out shade. It doesn't matter what type of livestock it is, doesn't matter what color the livestock is. And that's where silvopastures really excel. Guadalupe had mentioned in her presentation that you typically have temperatures underneath tree canopies that are roughly 6 degrees Celsius lower, and that's what we have seen, temperatures of 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. We can use the livestock as a vegetation management tool, which I just showed in the previous slide. We're offering them a more diverse range of nutrition to choose from, not just the herbaceous plants, but woody plants as well. And then we're often doing silvopasturing on land that's already being marginally used, and we can grow more crops. We can be growing both livestock products and timber products together, and that in turn helps us increase the viability of our ranching operations. Next slide. So one of the other benefits that's just recently being looked at with silvopasturing too is that the list of benefits I just explained are really a reaction to a problem, but I also see silvopasturing as part of the solution. This book was published in 2017 called Drawdown. Many of you have, I'm sure, heard of it. Let's go to the next slide, please. And silvopasturing ranked prominently in this book. Let's advance to the next slide, please. As the top-based land, or the top-ranked land-based approach to sequestering carbon, and you can see some of the excerpts there from this book. And that bottom one is particularly important to us in that we have we see silvopastures as buffering all the weird and erratic weather. One of the slides that I meant to put in here but didn't is to give you some context. Both of our farms here, both here in the northern and southern hemisphere, are increasingly prone to erratic weather events. Some years it's too wet, but increasingly many years it's too dry and too hot. We had a historic drought here in upstate New York this past summer, where we only received about 20% of our normal rainfall over a 5-month period. And it was really the trees and the availability of the fodder that helped pull us out of that. We also had a catastrophic range fire in our ranch in central Argentina this past November, and we were able to get the animals. We lost about 99% of our stockpiled forage, and we were able to keep the animals alive on willow and poplar fodder for the crucial weeks as the grass started to grow back. So just 2 more slides. Let's go to the next one, please. If you're interested in learning more about silvopasturing, we've compiled a lot of good resources on our forestry extension page. It's at forestconnect.info site below. There's information there on creating a silvopasture management plan, on evaluating the potential sites for silvopasture development. And then final slide, please. And after a very successful conference in 2011, we created this Ning forum, the silvopasture.ning.com, and that was to network people that are interested in silvopasturing and keep them apprised of big events coming up. And we have about 500 current members. So in a lot of the information that we do from different educational events, we archive on this site. So that's my final slide, and thank you. I'll turn it back over to Helen.
Thank you very much, Brett. That was really interesting to see, especially the comparisons between the 2 countries that you work in as well. So we've got probably about 15 to 20 minutes on this session for questions before we go across to the Zoom where we can continue with more questions. I'm just waiting for the questions to come through to me so that I can actually see them. So just bear with me. I'm just trying to. Right, okay. So I'm going to start with them, hopefully in the order of popularity. So the first question: if trees raise temperatures at night, doesn't that cancel out the good effects? So I think that's probably, looking at about, obviously it lowers it during the day. So who would like to go first with that one? Do you want to go first, Paul, and then I'll transfer over to Guadalupe?
Yes.
I wouldn't have thought that rules out the positive effects. As Brett was sort of saying, the effects of, and Guadalupe was saying, the effects of trees is generally to moderate the temperatures, so to decrease them during the day when extreme temperatures are high, and at night that those high temperatures are not so critical, and therefore sort of moderating and increasing temperatures at night is less of an issue. So I would have thought the moderating effect is overall a more positive effect.
Thanks, Paul. Guadalupe, would you like to add?
Yeah, I agree. The effects during the day, so the high temperatures reached during the day are so excessive for the crop that any help that the tree can provide is useful. And the buffering in the night hours, I think it's less important and it's not negative for the crop. Not, I think that the effect that the trees can do during the day, buffering extreme temperatures, is extremely valuable, and the night effect is almost irrelevant. I don't think there is a problem there.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, right, so the second question I've got on my list is, somebody has spent over 10 years in Southern Europe and the lack of trees has always surprised them, particularly in urban areas. Is there a consideration for how much water they consume? So, Guadalupe, shall I start with you first and then I'll perhaps pass over to Paul?
Yeah. The lack of trees is a consequence of the simplification of the agricultural system and things like that. And in the urban areas, I don't know, maybe there is a trend to not having trees, maybe because they consume water, but for example, there is a lot of grass and for aesthetic and things like that, and grass consume much water than some trees. So I don't think it's like a water problem. I think it's like a way of thinking, and we need trees, especially in urban areas, because the trees rich in the soil, it's higher, and I think it's going to be a problem, and we are suffering the consequence now. So I think it's like more of a way of thinking.
I'd like to add to that. So at our ranch in Argentina, one of the slides that didn't make it in was to show rainfall, and it actually rains 1,000 millimeters a year at our ranch in central Argentina, and it also rains about 1,000 millimeters a year at our farm in New York. And yeah, if you looked at the vegetation in those slides, you'd notice that in Argentina, the vegetation clearly appears to be from a much more arid climate, and that's because the infiltration rate on our treeless ranges there, that's to say the non-silvopasture areas, is very low. So a lot of that precipitation comes in very hard, intense seasonal storms, and consequently there's tremendous runoff. And what we've seen over the past few decades with the creation of these large afforestation silvopastures is that the trees intercept and allow to infiltrate a much larger percentage of that total precipitation. So on one hand, the trees consume water, although in Paul's slide, he showed a very interesting slide in the Deza where you had the green rings below the home oak, and that's because of the hydraulic lift effect of those trees, presumably, as well as perhaps some of the temperature buffering. So even though trees may consume water, in many cases, I think they're net contributors to creating a lower soil moisture deficit.
Paul, did you want anything further to add?
I was just, we've done some research recently about different types of land use. This is in Southern Europe, and the degree of fire risk. And that research was showing if you've got sort of unmanaged shrubland, that land is almost at the greatest risk of fire. But where you've got sort of managed dehiscer and there's active management, particularly of sort of widely spaced home oak, then the fire risk is a lot less. So having some sort of land management around is a key part of fire management, certainly in dry rural areas.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And leading on to this, there's a question directed at Guadalupe in relation to water. When the cereal yield was lower with walnuts, do you feel this is mostly due to direct competition for water? In some places, there are special mechanical annual root pruning of the tree crop. Did the walnuts have root pruning in your experiment? And that was asked by Gary.
Okay. No, the walnuts of my experiment were not root pruning, but I think that there is there is not a water problem, because when cereal yield was lower under the trees, this year had a normal spring, that is when abundant rainfall. And I think it's most like Brett has said, when water is scarce, trees act like a bomb of water and bomb of nutrients and help the crop. But when the water is not scarce and it's no problem for water, there is a strong competition between crops and trees. It's like complex to understand, but when the climate is it's hard, the trees and the crops are friends, or saying like this. But when the climate conditions are good, the agroforestry system is not so interesting. It's more interesting for bad conditions. Well, here in Spain, we are all for agroforestry because our conditions are so bad, are expected to be worse. So this is the moment when the agroforestry, in my experience, is most recommended.
And Paul, from a UK perspective, obviously part of this session is what we learn from other parts of the world.
Yeah, so it's certainly in a UK situation, as light levels start to decrease, that will tend to reduce the yield of any crop in a UK context. Key species in a UK context that will tend to do well with trees are either autumn sown crops, or species such as grass, where you've got a vegetative yield. And under water stress conditions, particularly in the early years of tree establishment, then the trees themselves might also suffer from water stress with a crop.
Okay, I may come back to some of, we've got another couple of questions directed at Guadalupe, but maybe we've also got quite a few directed at Brett, so I'll perhaps do those and then come back to the Guadalupe question specific. So Brett, these are really more for you. How do you keep the cattle within any one particular grazing unit? Are they fenced in, and if so, how?
So we use permanent fencing to divide up our small paddocks that are a hectare or two in size, and it's all electrified fence. Cattle are very easy to manage with electrified systems, and it's easy to create high densities when we need to using that electric fence. Pigs, sheep, goats, you need more robust fencing to do that. There was a question above that one, Helen. Could I address that quick? Yeah. So the question was, does the livestock cause damage to trees? How do we protect newly planted trees? And are there trees I wouldn't recommend silvopasture? And I think it'd be interesting for Guadalupe to maybe address that in the context of alley cropping systems as well. So we use the good grazing management to minimize damage to the trees. And we are not worried about young trees or what we would think of as regeneration until we reach the life cycle in that silvopasture where we need to think about new trees. In other words, we're growing these trees in what's known as an even age system. But when it's time to regenerate portions of our silvopasture, the fences that keep animals in today can keep them out when we need to grow back a new young future silvopasture. And as far as what trees I wouldn't recommend, just any tree that's functional. So trees that provide shade and survive and thrive is a good start, but trees that produce forest products or things like fruits and nuts are even better.
Thank you. Guadalupe, would you like to talk about it in the context of alley cropping from your experience?
No, I think that in all the livestock thing, I'm a little out of that. I'm focused on cereals and trees, so I prefer not to say something that it's not.
No, sorry, I meant in context of the different. Obviously, you've looked at walnuts and in the cereal cropping and the desert system. But I just wondered if you'd had any experience of any other trees within the alley cropping.
Sorry, I couldn't understand.
Within your research within terms of silver arable with the cereal cropping, have you had any other experience other than walnuts in the alley cropping? Other tree species?
Other trees, yes, but in the and other crops, but like, I don't know, some legumes or something like that. But we only tested some different species, but we prefer to center in the cereal, so I cannot say much about other crops.
Okay, going back to Brett, when you fed the willow and poplar to the cattle, did you cut branches and leave them in situ in the field?
Yeah, it was labor intensive, but it was taking stored feeds up to our ranch is practically impossible. It's very isolated. We can't take emergency hay bales in. So really the only solution, but it worked quite well, was to go in and prune branches and do, in some cases, thinnings. We actually did the same thing on our farm this summer to get through the drought, and it worked very well. So sometimes droughts force you into doing things that you wanted to do but never quite found the time to do it. But if you have 100 hungry cows that need a lot of food every day, trees can be part of that diet, and certainly saved us twice here in the recent months, both with a drought we experienced in New York as well as the range fire that we experienced on our ranch in Argentina.
Certainly, Paul, in 2018 in the UK, there are lots of photos on social media of farmers saying the only thing green on our farms are the hedgerows. So yes, I think certainly in those extreme weathers, that's when trees really come into being very important. I'm not sure if you've got any comments you'd like to make, Paul, from your experience of working with Ag Forward across the various European countries in that context.
I guess in Spain and Portugal, it's the oaks that are the main species. There has been work done with poplar as well, and chestnut is the other species I've seen work done. A lot of the work is emphasizing perhaps the importance of having a variety of species.
Yeah. Certainly, we've just been doing some work with Joe, actually, Joe Smith, in terms of farmers feeding willow, and in particular, it's providing very valuable mineral supplements. So, for example, willow will provide fattening lambs with the cobalt that they require. So, there's all sorts of angles to it, both from a nutritional and a medicinal point of view, that various different tree species. So there's a lot that we don't know. I think there's a lot of anecdotal and historic information, but there's still lots more to find out. There's a couple of questions that I
think I was going to say, one of the advantages of a sort of an agroforestry sort of environment is that you're creating a variety, so animals can choose for themselves what's most appropriate. So if they're too hot, they can go into the shade, and another individual might not feel that. And likewise, as you've just mentioned, Helen, on the sort of mineral deficiency, sort of self-medication side, individual animals can sort of start browsing on what they feel is meets their needs.
Guadalupe, there's a couple of questions specifically on your research. The first is, did you compare the nutritional value of the cereals? Would you expect a difference between the agroforestry and monocropping systems?
Yes, we compare the nutritional value. Sometimes, phosphorus and potassium in the grain, but the most important parameter is nitrogen. And in the nitrogen, we saw that, for example, in the dehesa, there was an increase of grain nitrogen beneath the trees that is relevant and valuable. But in the walnut agroforestry system, there was a decrease in the nitrogen protein content. So there is a strong dependency. There is the result of the agroforestry system depends on tree species and crop species, because the results are contradictory results. So I think there is a need of more research on that, and a need to know why there is more nitrogen content in these species or less content, because Paul said in this presentation that maybe there was an increase in nitrogen content because the time of the development of the crop was larger beneath the trees. But in my research, the time of the cereal development was less beneath the trees, and the grain nitrogen content was higher than in full light conditions. So I think it's not clear the reason of why when one species could increase their nitrogen content beneath the trees or not. I think there is a need to investigate that and to do more research on that, on the nutritional value that is always important with the productive terms, but also the nutritional value. So I think it's not clear yet.
No, yeah, lots of this. There's a lot more research is needed, I'm sure. And then the second question related to you, Guadalupe, was are breeding programs based on shade acclimated traits the ultimate boost to establish successful agroforestry systems combining trees and crops?
Well, I think it is, because since the other elements of the system, like water, nutrients, can be solved by managing them. I don't know, adding water or adding nutrient with fertilizer, something like that. But the species we choose to cultivate beneath the trees that have been always selected for full light conditions need to be selected for safe conditions, because there is not a parameter we can change. There is only selection programs and breeding the solution for that. So shade can only be solved by doing these breeding programs.
Thank you. This is a general question. I think it could be looked at from all angles. There have been much research to show woody habitats provide shelter for natural enemies and so would improve pest control, which can be an increasing risk in hotter climates. Have you seen evidence of this? So perhaps, Paul, you could perhaps start with that from a silver arable perspective, but it'd be interesting to hear that from Brett and Guadalupe as well.
Yes, so certainly there is evidence that the sort of area under trees and the sort of vegetation associated under the trees can provide a sort of a refuge and a habitat for beneficial invertebrates, sort of spiders, etc. That can then in turn sort of predate potential pests. So that's certainly possible.
Yeah, I mean, there's some work that we've been doing in the UK with a PhD student at Reading who's been looking at that in 3 silver arable sites in the UK. And so I think there's definitely far more good boys, good insects and good pollinators, but you have to balance that with potential for control. How do you manage that tree habitat to ensure you don't also encourage the less good bugs like slugs in the UK? So I think, yes.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Brett, from a silvopastoral point of view, is there anything that, I mean, perhaps you've mentioned obviously controlling of invasive plants through the cattle. We get questioned in the UK all about always it's
sure.
cattle and flies, sheep and flies. If you get when you get cattle and sheep with trees, you're going to get flies. Do you find that as a problem?
So external parasites like blood-sucking flies and tick, and those are major challenges to any livestock operation. So anecdotally, we certainly see a greater richness and diversity of bird species in these savanna-like silvopasture systems. And also we have seen that what we think of as blue-faced hornets here that tend to nest in low shrubs, including some of the invasive shrubs like multiflora rose, those apparently are a big predator of some of the tabanoids and other really nuisance biting flies.
Okay, I'm just being told that we need to probably, I think, go over to the Zoom room. So it's difficult because I can't see how many people are actually listening to us. But if you've got the Zoom link in chat, then please do come and join us. And it's an opportunity to to perhaps just ask some, practical questions to Brett about how he handles his silvipastoral scheme and further ideas that Guadalupe has with her research. So do come and join us.